also welcome everyone to the first of 3 Environmental Justice and Climate Candidate Forums 2020. Thank you. I am Debbie McGee. This is Linda Perrine. We are the 350 Eugene Climate Emergency PAC. I'm also happy to introduce Pablo Alvarez. Yeah, Pablo. Pablo works for and represents the NAACP Lane County and also Beyond Toxics. On behalf of the co-sponsors, I want to express our gratitude that you chose to spend your precious time here with us tonight. I want us to acknowledge that we are meeting tonight on the traditional homeland of the Kalapuya people. Their lands were stolen by my colonizing ancestors from Europe. The Kalapuya are still here, living among us, upholding their traditions and their values as best they can. I also want us to acknowledge that this country's economic prosperity was built on the backs of black people. People kidnapped, enslaved, sold as chattel, people systematically denied equality, and people still persecuted today. We cannot change our past, but we can make reparations for harm done. The climate crisis, the environmental crisis, is also a crisis of racial justice. We have created a system that causes the least powerful and the most impoverished to live and work in places most polluted and toxic. We believe that 2020 is the most important election of our lifetimes. This election must be about climate and environmental justice if we are to survive. We believe this is the do or die decade. This is our last chance. The last 10 years to avert the worst of the climate collapse. We must elect climate champions in 2020. I want to assure you that every single candidate who registered with Orstar was invited to participate tonight. I also want to share that due to a short but challenging legislative session in Salem, Julie Fahey, who had planned to be here, is unable to attend tonight. Thank you so much for caring about environmental and racial justice and for the life of all living things.
Sorry, it's really right there. Hi, I'm Marty Wilde. It's good to see so many familiar faces here. I represent the Kalapuya district, which I named that with the permission of the tribe in recognition of their historic territory here when I took it over in 2019. It's parts of Lane and Lynn County, stretching from Creswell up through southeast Eugene to the university, around Springfield, but only in it for one neighborhood for some reason, and then all the way up into about the southern half of Lynn County. So it's a really interesting district, diverse in terms of lifestyles, not so diverse in other ways, you might say. I do convey the regrets of my colleagues. Sorry, I'm being told to speak up and bring this closer. Julie, in particular, is actually in a committee meeting right now on climate change legislation. So you're stuck with me, but the good news is I'm on the House Energy and Environment Committee, so I can tell you a little about what we did, and I've only got 2 minutes up front, so I'm going to run through a lot of things really quickly, and if you're curious, you can ask me about them. So in my first year, in our first session, we did the Oregon Environmental Protection Act, maintaining environmental standards even if the federal government lowers them. We banned fracking. We banned plastic bags. We reduced the use of plastic straws. We banned offshore drilling. We did some oil train legislation. Can't prohibit them, unfortunately, but we did make them safer. And we passed dirty diesel legislation, which will help a lot of those, that Rosa Parks school, which is just sitting right over the Rose Quarter, and those poor kids are getting that all the time. So those were some good, big accomplishments for last session. Of course, what we didn't get across the finish line was climate legislation. It passed my house easily. The Republicans kept saying, well, it's really a tax bill. It needs a 3/5 majority. It's not, but we passed it with a 3/5 majority anyway. Unfortunately, the Senate ran out, and so now we're continuing that conversation. This session, just a few highlights here. House Bills 4066, 4067, and 4068. Those are three bills that increase access to electric vehicles, and they protect low-income people from rate shocks. We're working on a mattress recycling program with St. Vinny's. We are recharging the failed septic tank funding bill. There's a lot of water quality problems from people with septic tanks in rural areas that fail. We're expanding buffers for aerial spraying. I know, I'm working on it. I'm only one vote. That's on next session. We passed a chlorpyrifos ban yesterday, big news, and I'm testifying again on it tomorrow in the Senate side. So we're hoping to get that through. And of course, hazardous algal blooms, so protecting your drinking water from cyanotoxins. And of course, cap and trade. That's the big one for this session, the unfinished business from last time. I do want to cover just a few more things. I had a bill fail this year protecting tribal water rights, and so I want to bring that one back. There's a big plastic stewardship program. I think we're aware that we can't recycle as many plastics as we used to, but there's a big move to have a program for that. Complete aerial spraying ban is what I want to bring back. And more protections for drinking water. We're doing the interim work on the hazardous algal blooms, but we know we need to do something more permanent. So I'm sure that was more than 2 minutes, but had a lot to say, so I'm sorry about that.
All right. So we're going to try, can you turn your mic off when I ask a question, just to see if that's a problem? There you go, perfect, thank you so much. So as the first question, one of the questions that we're going to be asking all of the candidates is, why do you think environmental justice and racial justice go hand in hand, and what policies do you have to address it? Or would you like to see to address it?
I think they do go hand in hand. One of the things we saw in the initial draft of this year's cap and trade legislation was, in the initial draft, there was no just transition fund. So that had the potential to put people out of work without training them for the new jobs and green industries in the future. So that was a really important piece to me. I think the chlorpyrifos ban is another one that really has a strong racial justice lens. It didn't pass, and it was always going to the Agriculture Committee. And we said, all right, we need to adjust our lens on this. And so we said, look, this is really about protecting the health of farm workers. And we got all these, frankly, mostly white farmers who would come forward and say, well, it's not such a big deal, I only do it once a year. I said, yeah, but your workers go from farm to farm to farm. So one, it's not safe at any level, but two, when they're getting it several times a year, their exposures are much higher. So that was when we put it through the Health Committee, passed easily, and hopefully we'll pass through the Senate if they stick around.
Mic off. Weird, so sorry about that. It seems to be good right here.
Okay.
Yeah, so right here.
Representative Wilde, we believe that we're in a climate emergency. Do you? And if you do, what do you think are the most appropriate actions that we should be taking right now?
I do as well. I think we're trying to do the most appropriate thing we can, which is cap our carbon emissions and reduce them as quickly as we can. That's about it.
Water. Okay, so one of the first questions that I have specifically to you is that do you believe that the state legislature should have the power to intervene in cities' zoning policy when cities are failing to adapt to the needs that climate change will bring in terms of zoning, land use, and all the other code and buildings that are going to be necessary for cities to adapt to?
Yes, I do. The most, I think, important bill that nobody paid attention to in housing policy last year was House Bill 2003. Everybody's talked a lot about House Bill 2001, and we can talk a lot about that. But House Bill 2003 sets a requirement that cities inventory their existing housing stock and make projections overseen by the state for the housing stock they will need in the future. So if I was going to propose another bill to follow up on that, it would say, and if you don't produce that housing, here are the things you're going to lose. We've seen other states adopt that and say, you know, the state actually provides a great deal of transportation funding, and what we don't want to do is spend more money on transportation infrastructure to support sprawl or to support low-density housing. And so I think the first thing you might see is, and if you don't produce the housing, you don't do the things you need to do to reduce barriers to the construction of the dense housing we need, you know, especially the low-income housing we need, then you're going to risk losing state funds. I mean, we want to work collaboratively with localities. It is a shared responsibility between the cities and the state, but there are cities that just won't do anything. And so good news is I think we're going to be able to get $60 million for low barrier shelter and a navigation center. That's $60 million statewide. Our share would be about $6 if we get a proportional share. And I think I've really seen a lot of proactive engagement between the city and the state. Honestly, it's the most optimistic I've felt about that issue in the 10 years since I moved back after military service.
That's good.
What are you doing to reach out to other legislators, including senators, to help improve the chances of a cap and invest bill actually passing in this short session?
Mostly they tell me to shut up because I'm too far left. And even my allies say, well, maybe we'll send somebody else to talk to them. I reach out. It started on the Senate side this time. We actually had a robust conversation around what was called the Oregon Resilient Communities Act, which was our House version of cap and trade in November, December timeframe. And then the action kind of moved over to the Senate, and they were bringing some people into the conversation that had previously been hard-nosed on that. And so we kind of took a step back and said, okay, what's going to make you a yes? Because we know we need to do this. Since they came out with their initial draft, we've made significant suggestions to improve that, including the Just Transition Fund, including rate relief for low-income people, and some other tweaks we think they'll make the program stronger and more, well-balanced for everyone. The initial draft that came over from the Senate, it was, shall we say, it was very corporate-focused. It reflected a lot of corporate interests and not a lot of consideration of what would happen on the ground. And I think the product they're working on now is substantially better for low-income folks.
All right, we're going to take a question here from the crowd, and one of them is that why are reps giving so many carve-outs for cap and trade legislation? And so I'm guessing that some of those carve-outs might also include, the 95% free.
Yeah, the allowances. The short answer is votes. I've always said, given the current constitutional requirements for quorum and their willingness to walk out, we're never going to get as far as I'd like to go. So the question is then, if we can't go as far as I'd like to go, can we build a foundation that we can improve on? And so that's kind of been my bottom line is this going to help us move forward next session when I think we will have some restrictions on walking out, or at least increasing the price for it. So there are a lot of conversations about that. I've tended to say, there was this question about 95 versus 100% allowances for what we call energy-intensive, trade-exposed industries. I was a big advocate for 95 because you got to have some skin in the game. They said, well, look, if we do 100, we can always change that going forward. Then the question was, okay, but we want to manage them through what we call best available technology, meaning are they really doing what they can do, and then how often are we going to look at that? Is it going to be like, oh, you're best available technology now, so you're good for another 20 years, or was it going to be, hey, we're going to be back next year, and make sure you've caught up with the state of the art? So those are the kind of things we've negotiated. By we, I mean the Senate at this point, and that's it's giving away more than I'd like. I do have some confidence that we're not giving away more than we have to. I do find it just deeply ironic that the Republicans keep complaining about these lengthy amendments that have the carve-outs, and I said, they're the things you're asking for. So I think we'll get something across the finish line. I think it is still worth doing. I realize there's probably some disagreement in the audience with me, and I'm going to say I don't think it's as far as I want to go, but it is still something I think we can use to build as a foundation to build on in later sessions.
So as a follow-up to that, how far would you want to go? Because we know that cap and trade cannot be the end and will not solve all the problems, even if it was the best cap and trade that we could have. And so if you could have your ideal type of bill, what would it include?
Oh, I signed on to the Green New Deal, so that would be as far as I would go. There's initiative petitions. If we aren't able to pass cap and trade, there's initiatives, petitions 48, 49, and 50. There are two different variations, one on green energy, 100% green energy mandate, and then the last one is more of a carbon cap. The environmental community got them all qualified initially over the objections of the Secretary of State, I'll note. So good on them. And I think what they'll do if we are unable to pass something is they'll figure out which one polls the best and circulate it for the signatures to actually get it on the ballot. So which of those do I like the best? Probably the carbon-free economy by I think it's 2045 is the strongest one. I do like that. I think it is 50, I think. Sorry. I'm sure somebody here knows better than I do. But that's the one I like the best, but I also defer to them in their polling. You have to get people on board, and it can be a challenge. Yeah, so that's what I would say. Yeah.
With some of your colleagues in the legislature proposing the giving of renewable tax energy credits to things that I think a lot of advocates do not consider renewable tax credits, renewable energy, what do you consider clean renewable energy?
Yeah, the RECs, this has largely come up in the context of the Covanta bill, which was Senate Bill 451 last time. I don't remember the number off the top of my head this time. 4049, thank you. So that bill, Covanta is a garbage burning facility. It has a mix somewhere between 40 and 60% of sort of biogenic materials. And what happened was the facility's been operational since the 80s, I believe. And they say there was a deal where they were going to get renewable energy credits before I was there, but they didn't get it done in time. The thing about the renewable energy credits are they're supposed to incentivize new use of renewables. They're not supposed to incentivize things you're already doing. So when they came to me, I mean, there's some jobs involved. They came to me and they said, well, we want you to support this. I said, I'm probably not going that direction, but tell me how much these RECs are worth. Show me that you really are going to go out of business if we don't do this, because, you've been in business for, 38 years or something. And they said, well, we figure it's about $2 million a year. I said, okay, that's one answer. Now, what's the facility's bottom line? Because you're part of a larger corporation, and they know exactly whether your facility is profitable or not. And if you need some assistance to make a transition, I'd rather give it to you through the front door and get you to a greener space than undermine the RECs program by giving a garbage burning facility RECs. And they never got back to me, and so I called them out on it. I said, I'm not here to give welfare to corporate shareholders. And I'll say the other folks that were trying to get us to do that deal was Marion County. And Marion County said, well, we have this deal, and it helps us with our recycling program. And then last week, an article came out and said, well, they accept that time when they took all that money and built a building. And I'm like, well, okay, now that the other reason I might have supported it is gone too. So I was never inclined to support it in the first place. The RECs program is, like I said, it is designed to support new renewables, not to incentivize things you're already doing.
So this is going to be the last audience question. I want to remind everyone, if you don't have technology and you want an index card, please just raise your hand and one of our volunteers will go around. Thank you. The last question, and then when you're done answering, you can go into your final statement, your closing statement, is do you oppose clear-cut logging practices in our state lands?
I do. I grew up in a forestry community. I was almost run over by a log truck as a child, so that had a kind of an impact on me. The truth is there's a million different sustainable ways of logging, but we've chosen, this clear-cut approach, and it's all about the Douglas fir monoculture. If you grow other kinds of trees, so like red cedar. Red cedar is almost the same market price as Douglas fir right now. Red cedar is shade tolerant, so you don't need to do clear cuts. If you're going to grow Douglas fir, there's ways of mimicking organic patterns by doing smaller sort of periodic ones. Do that. There's a lot of different sustainable forestry practices. I think, obviously the deal we made on the forestry practices has some upsides and downsides. I think the benefit is we really are going to have that conversation about reforming our forestry practice, which is something that we've never been able to do. So I think there's a process for that going forward, and I'm looking forward to banning the practice if we can.
So we're going to take one more question since we hadn't gotten a note card. So if you have a note card before, while I'm asking these questions, please just lift them in the air, and the candidate will, a volunteer will come get it. So the last question, and then you can go to your closing statement, is: are you in favor of reversing the statewide ban on allowing counties to ban the use of genetically modified crops in their county?
Yes, very much so. I grew up on an organic farm. Yes, I mean, the short answer is yes. I was working on a bill that would have allowed Josephine County's ban to take effect. I think I was also working on a bill that would really address the problem of crop contamination more holistically, because the system we have now doesn't really work for anybody. There's actually huge cross-contamination issues between hemp and cannabis, for instance. And so, frankly, I have strong feelings about the GMO issue in particular, but we generally need a better system for managing crop conflicts, just so that people can grow, the way they want to grow, but not interfere with other people's right to grow what they want to grow as well. That was the whole principle behind the Right to Farm Act, and it's just been overcome by events and technology, and so it's important. And frankly, what we know about the environment these days. So, closing? Well, thank you all for coming out, and thank you for your support on environmental things. I guess I'll just say in closing, I realize I learn new stuff about my job every day, and so it must be intensely frustrating sometimes to see how opaque things look from the outside. So I'd encourage you to reach out to your state representative. You can reach out to me if you don't get an answer. We try to get back to folks as quickly as possible and let them know where things are and the ways they can best engage with the process where it is right then. And so that's my message to you is I'm here to help you engage with your government and to be the most effective advocate you can. Thank you very much.
Perfect.
I think what the...
We got the results here, by the way, so when you don't see the results, we're going to be posting them on our Facebook event of what the polls are showing of what you all are answering to. Okay, so our next candidate, thank you so much for joining us today. So our next candidate is running for the 13th District of the House of Representatives in Oregon. Please join us, running candidate David Smith. Thank you for joining us.
I might need that. My name is David Smith, and I'll take a couple of minutes to introduce myself to everyone in the room. I was born and raised in Eugene. I went to the second graduating class from Sheldon High School, and I graduated in 1965. Spent 2 years in the Army right after that. A year of that was in Vietnam. And came back, went to the University of Oregon, and I graduated in 1972 with a Bachelor of Political Science. Shortly after that, I moved to San Francisco. I got my first job with a bank as a real estate appraiser. It was something that I actually liked, and I continued to do that for the next 45 years. I moved back here in 1998 and worked as an independent fee appraiser for various banks in the city, and I retired in 2016. That gave me time now to run for office, something I kind of dreamed about for a long time but never thought I would ever do. One of the main things that brought me to run for office was the real estate taxes and things that are happening to seniors. They're driving a lot of seniors out of their homes. Every year they go up. Every year there's bond issues that people want to pass, and they're all for maybe good causes. But if you're on a fixed income, how are you going to do that? Right now, a lot of Social Security checks would have to pay 50% of that check, maybe 30% of that check, just to set the money aside every month to pay your real estate property taxes. $5,000, $6,000 is a lot of money when you're on a fixed income. Anyway, so I wrote a petition. It's number 38, and it's filed with the Secretary of State. And I would encourage you to look that up on the computer and see what I had to say. I think I wrote a really good one, and I think it would benefit people a lot. I realized that I had to get 112,000 signatures to put it on the ballot. I don't have an army of 500 or 600 people to collect signatures for me, so I kind of dropped the idea. I wanted to leave that petition still in the computer. So I decided to run for office and try to get it done that way. I know this is a quorum about climate change and how things have developed in cities that affect minority groups the most. I can actually speak to that. As an appraiser, I had to learn what took place in a city from the time it was a general store to the time it was a city like Portland or Eugene or Salem. That grew over time. And there are reasons why everything's located where they are. There really are. It didn't just happen by circumstance. One of the biggest problems, and it's been in every city, you can find this in New York, Chicago, you can find it in Indiana, you can find it everywhere. The best land went to the people with the most money. They built mansions, they had homes on the hilltops, they had views. The railroads were built on the most level land you could get. They don't navigate well in hills. That's why we have the railroad tracks right along the river. And instead of, like in Texas, where they made malls and parks and walkways and all kinds of neat things for people, we have a railroad track. They're going to fix that, I think. It got down to the part where what's the most worthless land in an area? Here in Eugene, that worthless land was West 11th towards Fern Ridge. And at the time, the city, when I grew up, the city might have stopped just short of 18th Avenue, maybe a few blocks on the other side. They're all President Streets. And the land is so filled with clay and so rotten, you can't have livestock, you can't grow agricultural crops, and you could buy that for pennies on the dollar, right? So who got stuck with it? Guess. Mostly the black community in Eugene. They worked for the railroad, they were porters and conductors and brakemen and so on, and that was their primary focus. When I went to Sheldon High School, we had, I think, 5 black students, and they were all great. Everybody loved them. We all got along fine. This one sweet girl, she was in our valley, and she was in a prom court. I played baseball with a couple of guys and football. Great kids.
Okay.
I didn't find out until I was in my 30s.
10 seconds, please. Sorry, it's a little bit louder than I expected. Just, you have 20 more seconds for your closing statement. Oh, opening statement, my bad. So sorry.
Let me just finish this one thing. I didn't find out until I was in my 30s and talking to some people that I went to school with that racism was in my community. And it really was. I didn't know that. I'd never experienced it. When our teams went to Marshfield, Coos Bay, and they had a football game, basketball game, whatever, it would take, the game would start at 8 o'clock, they'd be over at 10, 11. They thought it was too late to bring the kids home at 1 o'clock in the morning, so they put them up in a hotel. Guess what happened to the kids that were the black kids on our team? They had to find housing because the hotels would not allow them to be part of the hotel room. So there were black families that allowed these kids to spend the night, get on the bus, come home the next day. I had no idea that it even existed. And it was a shock to me, and it really ticked me off. Anyway.
So for the next question is, you mentioned already a couple things that you think are related between the environment, environmental justice and racial justice. So what policies do you propose, and while at the same time, what policies do you propose while at the same time understanding that we need the environmental justice community, communities of color and low-income communities need investments from the government to be able to provide the services that we need to be able to combat climate change and environmental justice. So at the same time, if you're proposing a property tax reduction, what other places do you think that we can get the funds to implement the policies in environmental justice?
The seniors that are 65 and over have been supporting education for 3 generations. They've been supporting government their whole lives. I think it's time to give them a break. Okay? I anticipate they'll still be engaged in government, and they'll still have some property taxes to pay. They can't carry the burden any longer, and you can't expect them to start living in the streets like Los Angeles because they can't afford their homes. Now, I'm a little bit skeptical about climate change. I believe climate change is happening. I do. I believe it. It's been happening for millions of years. I'm just not exactly sure. Oh, no, wait a minute. Wait a minute. We've had climate change, we've had ice ages. When I was in college, every professor I had, whether it was American history, world history, whether it was some of the geology courses I took, every one of them said we were going to be dead in 10 years. Well, that was 1967, 1968. We're still here, okay? And all the excuses and all the things that they said haven't happened. Now, they've changed that from an ice age, and believe me, at one time Chicago was under 200 feet of ice, so that can happen. When that happened, there was not one motor and not one person with an engine or a machine on the whole planet.
Please let the candidate respond. We will be able to ask the questions. So please submit the questions, and I'll make sure to answer those questions.
I believe climate change is happening, and I believe it's happening right now. And when I hear another professor or another group of scientists say that we're all going to be dead in 12 years if we don't give more money to the government. Now, wait. I want to know what the government's going to spend that money on to make it all go away. And until I know that, I'm going to continue to be skeptical. When I was in college, there was a saying, I love my country, I fear my government. I still fear my government. I want my money to be spent wisely. In fact, if it were up to me and I could put a program together, I would have millions of trees planted because we live in a symbiotic relationship with trees. We put out carbon, they absorb it. They put out oxygen, we absorb it. And now we're having a carbon crisis. Let's put out something that's going to get rid of it. Everybody should plant trees. We've got 350 million people in this country. We could plant 350 million trees a week.
Not enough.
Okay, then plant 10 trees a week.
Okay.
Every person
Mr.
could
Smith.
plant 10 trees a week. How severe is this problem?
Mr. Smith, I have a follow-up question for you. Okay, please, I have a follow-up question, Mr. Smith. I have a follow-up question for you for what you were saying.
Okay.
So please, we're going to moderate this conversation so that it maintains itself well. So the follow-up question is that you are saying that people didn't die, and that you said that your professor said over and over. Well, 2,000 people died during Katrina, 4,000 people died during Puerto Rico. Wildfires continue to happen and increase and intensify. 97% of the scientists in the world agree that wildfires are going to grow, agree that hurricanes are going to get worse. And so if this is just part of climate change, even if we assume that your argument is correct, that it's always been happening, how is the government going to have the responsibility to address that? Let's assume his argument is correct. Let's assume your argument is correct, that climate change has always been happening. Would you not agree that a responsible government would try to minimize the suffering of the people that climate change is doing? And what role do you see the government playing in that, especially a state government, which is what you're running for?
That's the big question I have. What is government going to be doing to make this go away? Everybody has the problem at hand. Everybody's been told that things are going to happen and it's going to be disastrous. We're all on the verge of suffering and becoming extinct. Okay, so you give billions and billions and billions of dollars to the government, federal government, and state government. What are they going to do with it? What are they going to spend it on specifically to fix that problem? I really want to know that before I jump on the bandwagon and say, yes, let's all give these guys all the money we have.
Okay, we have a question from the audience, which is, what science are you basing your opinions about climate change? So I said that 97% of climate scientists agree that climate change has happened and it is human caused. And so if you have a different opinion, the audience wants to know which science you're using and if you could provide those statistics.
Okay, let me ask you, how many climate scientists are there? How many people are studying these problems in oceanography, in the sun, in the wind, in the dirt, and the earth movements and earthquakes? How many climate scientists are there? Thousands, right? Thousands. And there is a consensus. A consensus is at least 51%, I would assume, that, well, it depends on who you talk to and what you believe in. No,
can we
that's
please
not true.
let him answer the questions, please? Please submit them.
1/3 of the scientists worldwide have come to the conclusion that the data that's creating this climate change argument has been modified, tilted, and the software programs are maybe ineffective and insufficient. Listen, you might develop a software program with 500 different variables, or 500 million different variables, but Mother Nature's got billions of variables. Sometimes those things can be wrong. That doesn't...
Please, let's let him answer. You can make your decision when voting. This is what this is for. Please. So we're going to ask the questions. Candidate's going to answer. And if you don't agree with him, you don't have to vote for him. And you can go campaign for someone else. This is how democracy works, and we would appreciate it to keep it this way. Okay? So let him answer. And you can organize. Don't agonize, organize. And that's it. All right? Let him answer. We invited him. He was nice enough to come and answer the questions when other candidates didn't. So please, let him answer his questions.
I knew I was walking into a hornet's nest tonight. That my opinions and my views and the things that I want to understand and know for sure before I commit myself to something, I knew that wasn't going to be very popular.
Sorry. So based on your statement on your campaign website, it shows that you have a pretty clear sentiment against undocumented immigration. And what we know is that a lot of undocumented immigration is happening in America because of the effects of corporations and their practices in other countries. We can talk about hydroelectric corporations in Guatemala or mining in several other Latin American countries. Do you think that the government has a role in regulating those companies that create destruction in other countries?
Whichever, they're the same guy.
They're not the same.
There we go. I don't blame people for coming to this country. I don't blame them at all. If I lived in El Salvador and I had MS-13 guys beating on my door every day, taking my girls and my daughters away, I would come to America, believe me. I have a problem. We are either a country of laws. We're a country of organized morals and laws and a way of doing things. I don't understand how you can excuse 22, 30 million people that come across the border. The first thing they do is break a law. Not by coming across the border. They break a law because they went out and got fake ID. If I got fake ID and used it, I would be in jail for 20 years. They have to get fake ID. I understand that. I get it. But it's wrong. You want to bring these people in? I have no problem with that. My first wife was Mexican, okay? My second wife was Filipino. So don't even go there to think that I'm some hard-nosed white supremacist racist guy, because I'm not, okay? That doesn't fit me at all. But there's a right way to do this, and there's a wrong way to do this. You want to expand the number of people that can come into the country? Then do that, but bring them in through the front door. That's all. That's all I want. And then you can register them, you can have them vote, you can give them whatever help they need, you can put them in the record as being a person here in the United States legally. That's all I ask.
Okay.
That's not too much, is it?
We have a last question from the audience, and then when you answer the question, please do your closing statement. Please keep it at 2 minutes. You went a little bit over on your opening statement, so please keep it at 2 minutes. Where do you stand on the use of herbicides, and where do you stand on the use of herbicides? The use of herbicides. The use of herbicides on agriculture, pesticides, herbicides.
See, this here doesn't work very well.
Sorry about that. It's okay.
I think that there's a lot of natural ways where farmers could engage in using ladybugs and other types of things to reduce predators in their crops and insects that are disastrous to farmers. I'm all for that. We had to get rid of DDT a number of years ago. It was transferred into the human genome and things. It was disastrous. We were starting to make mutants because of all the crap that they put in our food. Okay, and so if we can clean that up, I'm all for it, 100%.
Your last statement?
Well, like I said, I knew I was walking into a hornet's nest tonight because I'm a Republican, and I would imagine 90% of the people in here are probably Democrats. I appreciate you all being here because I understand the concern. I understand hearing this in the news every day makes us alarmed, makes us worry, and I just think that there are ways that we can protect business, we can protect the things that make our community work. You can't shut businesses down and make everybody homeless and think the problem is going to go away, because it won't. That there are things we can do as a community that we can reduce our footprint, we can reduce the damage that we're doing to the planet, and if we all work together, it'll be a better place to live.
Thank you for answering questions. One of the questions that we got was what district Mr. David Smith is running for, and I want to clarify, it wasn't there, but it might have been small. It's the 13th district for the House of Representatives. Okay? The 13th district, you can look it up on the Oregon State Legislature. It's North Eugene, yeah. Okay, so our next candidate is running for the 4th Congressional District in the state of Oregon. Doyle Canning, could you please join us to the stage?
Thank you. Good evening, Eugene. It's great to be here with you. Just open. Okay, great. Thank you. Good evening. My name is Doyle Canning, and I am a mother. I am a community organizer, and I have been a leader in the climate movement for all of my adult life. I come from a rural working class community, and I have dedicated my career to standing with communities of color against racism, to working side by side in working class communities to take a stand against extractive industries and fight for clean air, for clean water, and for a stable climate and a thriving future. I have marched with indigenous peoples and leading environmental justice organizations on the national and global stage to build the climate movement, to focus on environmental racism, to focus on the global south, and to lift up the voices and the solutions coming from tribal communities and frontline communities that are leading the discussion about how we are going to find our way out of this crisis in a way that is just and in a way that is equitable. I have fought with migrant farm workers for better wages and working conditions. I have fought with farmers against chemical-intensive agriculture and taken on Monsanto. I have stood with tenants facing eviction by Wall Street banks in the wake of the foreclosure crisis. I have facilitated coalition building between workers' organizations and frontline community environmental justice groups to build an effective unity to stand together against the polluting industries that are poisoning workers and communities. Unlike our 33-year incumbent congressman who is not here with us tonight, my record on climate and environmental justice is consistently excellent. That is why I am the only Democrat here tonight who is running for Congress. I'm running because decades of failed leadership in Washington have led us to this moment of unprecedented crisis for our climate, for our country, and for our communities. And I have a vision that Oregon can lead the transition our planet so urgently needs to renewable energy, to regenerative forestry, for a just transition that it renews and revitalizes rural America. We are already building that here, and we can bring that to the national stage. We can fight for a Green New Deal that renews our rural communities and brings lasting jobs that create prosperity and cool our climate for generations to come. We have in this district some of the most important natural assets for the Green New Deal in the United States. We have some of the most promising potential for offshore wind generation off of Coos Bay. But the people who are trying to bring that project to Coos Bay right now, they can't find the engineers who know how to build it in this country. They're in Denmark. That's because Denmark has invested in offshore wind and the United States hasn't for decades. And that has to change, and it has to change fast. I'm running because instead of talking about building offshore wind energy off of Coos Bay, right now what we're having to do is talk about building a failed fracked gas fossil fuel pipeline across southern Oregon and an LNG export terminal that will be a disaster for our communities, for our climate, and for our future. Here, if I have anything to say about it, that's for damn sure. Here in our district, we have some of the most important forests on the planet for climate cooling, for carbon sequestration. The science coming out of OSU right now is clear. The forests that we have in Southwest Oregon are as important as the Amazon rainforest for the global carbon budget and balance. And we need to start treating them that way. But instead, we are clear-cutting them, spraying them with pesticides, and burning them in so-called renewable energy biomass facilities that our congressman has supported. That's why I'm running. In our district, we now are have the unfortunate distinction of being the nation's capital for homelessness. We have more people living on the street, sleeping outside tonight in Eugene, Oregon, per capita than anywhere in the United States. That didn't happen overnight. That is a result of decades of an economic and political system that has been rigged for the most wealthy and most powerful and against the rest of us. And now the West Coast of the United States is the fastest growing region in the country for homelessness, and the fastest growing group of people becoming homeless are people over the age of 65. This is a crisis that we cannot solve as little Eugene or even as the state of Oregon. Yes, we can and must do a lot more, but this crisis is tied to a national crisis of economic inequality and of a housing market that is out of reach for too many people. That's why I'm running for Congress. I look forward to your questions.
All right. The first question is that the current incumbent that you are challenging wields.
Oh, sorry.
So the current incumbent that you are challenging wields a great amount of power and influence in a committee that is important to environmental justice advocates. What would you say to a voter who is considering that influence over your actual campaign's platform?
I would say that, I thought you were going to ask me about environmental justice. I was really excited to talk about that.
The reason I ask is because the Committee on Transportation, is very important to activists in environmental justice. I might have explained that better. It's very important to environmental justice advocates as to where transportation and freeways and transportation is going to be built.
Agreed. Okay, so I would say that Congressman DeFazio is dangerous for the future of our climate. That's what I would say. I would say that this is a climate emergency that has been 33 years in the making, and where have you been and where are you tonight? I would say that my record on climate and environmental justice speaks for itself. You will never have to push me to take a stand on these issues. This is why I'm running. There is no conversation that is more important to me than the intersection of racism and the climate crisis. That is why I am running. The congressman has introduced a framework, not a bill, a framework that addresses transportation and infrastructure, and transportation emissions are up 20% in Oregon just in the last 4 years. This is an urgent crisis. It is one that cannot be solved with more highways. The framework invests 3 times as much in highway expansion as anything else in the bill, in the framework. So that tells you everything you need to know about the priority. I would say that our congressman's biggest donor last cycle was from a fossil fuel industry company. He has been taking their money for 18 re-election campaigns, and just last month took contributions from companies like the timber giant Weyerhaeuser, weapons maker Northrop Grumman, tax dodger Amazon, oil train runner CSX, S&B Engineering, who makes their money fracking gas. So it's clear who's spending against us in this election. And unlike my congressman, I have been fighting from day one to stop Pembina's pipeline in southern Oregon. And I want to talk about the environmental racism inherent in the Jordan Cove project that isn't talked about nearly enough. The Malin pumping station that would pump the gas into the pipeline in the southeastern corner of Oregon, adjacent to Klamath tribal lands, would create a pollution burden on that community consistent with the statistical records that these facilities are almost always sited in communities of color and have a disproportionate impact on communities of color and create health problems that can be deadly. We're talking about cancers. We're talking about asthma. We're talking about heart problems. We're talking about shorter lifespans because of the fossil fuel energy system that is currently enjoying the subsidies from our government to dominate the energy market. That's what has to change, and that's why you should support me in this election.
What would it look like if America was taking the climate crisis seriously at the federal, state, and local levels?
Did you hear that question? Okay. Well, what would it look like? It would look a lot like the vision that's put forward in the Green New Deal. It would look like a ban on fracking, which is something that I support. It would look like support for the Public Lands and Waters Climate Solutions Act of 2019, championed by Representative Holland, which our congressman does not co-sponsor. It would look like the fracking ban sponsored by Senator Sanders and Representative Ocasio-Cortez, which our congressman does not co-sponsor. It would look like the Environmental Justice Act of 2017, sponsored by Senators Booker, Warren, Merkley, Sanders, and with the support from the House of Jayapal and Grijalva, but not DeFazio. It would look like support for the resolution saying it is the responsibility of the United States to work for environmental and climate justice in the international community. Again, not something our congressman is supporting. That's the kind of political leadership that I will bring to the United States Congress. I'm the only Democratic candidate here with you tonight to have this conversation. And my vision is that we move our energy system to 100% renewable energy in the next 10 years. This is not negotiable. Physics is not interested in the political games of insider politics in Washington. We need a massive movement, a people's movement to challenge the status quo on fossil fuels. And this campaign is not about me. It is about us. It is about all of us taking a stand for a livable future. And if we had a United States government that was taking the climate crisis seriously, we would not have environmental racism.
We're going to take questions from the audience now. Just to let you know, you have 4 minutes. What does climate resiliency look like, especially taking into consideration that communities of color and the disabled community might not have access to the same resources as other communities, and what policies would you put forward to address that?
Yes, I think this is a great question, because so often environmentalists have put forward visions of environmental change that shortchange working people and communities of color. And that's why we're all here tonight, because we see those connections and we know that the only way forward is together. And I support the provisions in the Green New Deal that specifically talk about investment in depopulated, post-industrial, and frontline communities, which we have here in rural Oregon, and need the investment now, not 10 years from now, to transition out of extractive industry and into regenerative forestry, regenerative agriculture, renewable energy. There are specific provisions, for example, of the Fair Housing Act that need to be expanded to recognize the housing crisis is related not just to supply and demand or market forces, but also, as was mentioned earlier, specifically to racism. And we need to address that head on. And so you mentioned, the question mentioned disability and communities of color. I think an intersectional understanding of this climate crisis is to always center the voices and leadership of the most marginalized communities as the principles of environmental justice set forth. And those principles create a framework for decision making that will guide me. And one of the most important principles is consultation, and that marginalized communities speak for themselves and decide for themselves what solutions work best. And so that is how I will run my campaign and represent you in Congress.
Super quickly, you have 1 minute left.
Okay.
Is if elected to Congress, what House committee would you like to serve on? And I'll modify that a little bit to what committee would you like to serve on specifically to affect change in regenerative
Appropriations.
To specifically be able to help communities of color and environmental justice concerns?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I look forward to discussing that with the speaker, Ocasio-Cortez. In all seriousness, no, though, Appropriations is a powerful committee that gets to decide where the money goes. And that is Congress's primary function in our Constitution, is to appropriate funds. And so that is the place where everybody wants to be and where I would want to be advocating for the Green New Deal. Natural resources is obviously another important place to be, I think, for our district. Makes a lot of sense. And I would definitely want to represent there, as well as oversight. I look forward to speaking with the fossil fuel industry executives responsible for this crisis about what they knew and when they knew it and how much they owe the American people.
You can do your closing statement.
Okay. So in the fall, I was visiting with a landowner in Coos County who showed me the area down by the creek on her property where Pembina is planning to take her land. And it's right by a stream where the salmon come every year. And she shook my hand and said, "Thank you for fighting back." A few weeks ago, I was door knocking in Josephine County, and I talked to someone at the door who was a logger and who was about my age. He had served in Afghanistan. He said that he doesn't want to contribute to climate change, and he's done the research on how to convert his log truck to electric, and it kind of can't be done, and he can't afford it. And he's like, "Well, what do you want me to do, work at Starbucks?" And I said, "No, we need to fight for the Green New Deal. We need to make it possible for you and everyone in rural Oregon to get off of fossil fuels and get planting the trees that our planet needs to stabilize." And he said, "I've never voted before, but I'm going to vote for you." Supporters in Douglas County down in Roseburg threw one of the most successful events of the campaign so far. And we had a very heartfelt conversation about how the industrial timber industry owned by Wall Street investors just cuts and runs, automating jobs, laying off workers, polluting water, spraying people with chemicals, raking in the tax breaks, buying off the commissioners, leaving Douglas County with a child poverty rate now approaching 40%. And a grown man cried that night and said, "I'm worried that we have no future here." I'm running because I believe we have a future, that we hold the keys to the future here in this district, and that we can lead the nation in a transition to wind, wave, and solar energy. And the only thing that is standing in our way between us and that vision is a political system corrupted by corporate money and a democratic establishment that doesn't want that to fundamentally change that much. But it must change because our planet's survival is on the line. And you know what? We're changing it. One door knock, one phone call, one grassroots contribution at a time. This campaign is not about me. It's about you, and it's about activating everyday people, many of them for the first time in the political process, to fight for a world where one job is enough, where everyone has a place to call home, where the quality of the air that we breathe doesn't depend on our zip code or our family surname or the color of our skin. This election is now 89 days away, and if you believe in this vision, I need you to get involved and join 350 Action, Climate Hawks Vote, Sunrise Eugene, Sunrise Corvallis, DC Parks down in Douglas County. Join this movement. This is a climate-focused congressional race that is going to rock the nation. So thank you. Thank you for your support. And vote on May 19th.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Canning, for joining us today. We also have the a Republican candidate for the 4th Congressional District joining us today. Could you please join Mr. Nelson Ijih? Thank you for coming up today and joining us. And just because I didn't mention it to the candidates at the time, but it's 18 minutes is the total that we have. So we're going to be putting those cards up so that we can get everyone out of here by 9 p.m. We just have one more candidate after you. So thank you for joining us so much.
Sure, yeah.
Yep.
Hi, everybody. My name is Nelson Ijih, and I was born in Africa, specifically Nigeria, and moved over to the States after high school, and the journey led me all the way to Oregon, Hillsboro, Oregon. I went to school in Illinois first, and then California, and then Oregon. And Oregon, it's the longest place I've actually lived my entire life, because growing up back in Africa, we moved and were displaced multiple times because of wars. So I ended up here in Oregon, and I worked at Intel over in Hillsboro for almost 9-10 years. And I also teach part-time at Portland Community College, and I also own a small business. And I'm running for Congress because I believe what Doyle just said, which is it's a huge machine behind our political system. I think the battle is not between two parties. I generally believe that we need to foster in solutions that works for everybody. So I'm running for this seat because I believe in Oregon, and Oregon is my home. It's the longest place I've lived. I believe in term limits in Congress. It's one of the reasons why I'm running. I absolutely believe in campaign finance reform, because a lot of money goes into these machines that are running politics today in DC, and it doesn't matter what party, actually, both Republican and Democrats. So I believe the Republic is at risk of turning into an oligarchy if we don't do anything sensible to work for the common American. So that's one of the reasons why I'm running campaign finance. And also, one of the ideas why I'm running is that we should have zero taxes on people who work over 35 hours a week. So 0 income taxes on people working over 35 hours a week. So these are some of the ideas I'm running based on, and I'll be happy to answer more questions. And I also do believe in climate change, and that's the reason why I am the only Republican here at this event. And I remember my really exposure to really being aware of the environment was when I lived in Sweden for work. I lived in Sweden, and when I was there, and when I was living over there, I got exposed to a lot of the environmental issues, all the things that I think we need to do in the next few decades in order to slow down the damage that has been done to the environment. And that's the reason why I'm here.
Thank you for joining us. The first question that we have for you is that your platform states that limiting the influence of money on American elections, and you just mentioned it right now, it's a priority for you. And so would you say that this is also a priority that translates beyond just elections, but also the influence of money on environmental justice legislation? So we know that a lot of people with money are able to give money to pass bills that are harmful for communities of color in terms of the environment. So where do you see the limitations on not just campaign finance, but also money in the legislation making process?
So I was reading a report from, I think, The Hill, a newspaper, The Hill, that there's a list of all the lobbying that happens in D.C., and the list was pretty long. You know, I couldn't even count all of them. So I do believe that, like Doyle mentioned earlier, a lot of the donations, if you actually analyze, and I don't know if all of you guys do this, and I really encourage you guys to do and urge you guys to do this, to actually go and analyze who's donating money to what campaign and where the money is coming from. Because all the money that are being donated to either candidates or current Congress people there in DC influences how policy gets made. So if we all analyze all these, where the money is going and who is behind the money, then we can start changing things. We can start electing people who care for the people and are for the people, and we will change America, and we could bring justice to the people and the environment.
You mentioned that you do believe in climate change. Do you believe it's an emergency? How do you think Congress should be responding, and what are your thoughts on the Green New Deal?
Yes, I think 2 questions, right? Green New Deal and is climate change an emergency? Those are the 2 questions. How should Congress respond? I do believe that we need to do something about the environment. I don't know how fast we need to do or how quickly we need to handle the environment. I do believe in what one of the legislation that got put forward by, I think, a group of Democrats last year. I think it was an alternative to the Green New Deal. And I think they put the deadline about 2030 or 2050, I believe. So I think somewhere in between that, like 2030, between 2030 to 2050, somewhere in between that range, I think it's something that makes reasonable sense to really target in terms of dealing with the climate. So I do believe that emergency as a noun or emergency as in 15, 20 years, I do believe that in the next 20 years, we really need to cut down our carbon footprint. I do believe that.
So this is a follow-up for myself, and also we've gotten a lot of people asking that since you do believe in climate change and you do believe that investments are needed to combat climate change, you mentioned that you were, one of your policies was the tax cut for anyone that's working more than 35 hours for income tax.
Yes.
So if we need those investments and that action to be able to combat climate change, what is your plan to be able to have the money to actually make those investments happen?
Investment in terms of, you mean tax cuts or?
Well, if you're, I think the question would be if you're planning on cutting all these taxes, where are you going to get the revenue for so that we can act on on climate change?
That's a very good question, because right now America also has a big deficit problem, almost like 23 million, I think, in debt, the national debt. So I think it's a interesting question and a really problem that we need to address. In terms of people making, let's say, working class, working hard, I'm one of them, working hard every day, working even over 60 hours a week. Most working class Americans, I don't think the government will be making, by giving them that tax break, would really be detrimental to, I think, the government. I think we need to address how we need to maybe have some kind of like tax or tax incentives for migrating from fuel-powered technology, say boats, to battery-powered. We need to create incentive for the industry to migrate over to using battery-powered boats, because all these boats are sometimes in the water, they exhaust directly into the water, and it could damage the ecosystem, marine ecosystem, ecology. So I believe the solution is still, I don't have a perfect answer, but I would say that it's something that I'm willing to study more and have a better answer for that. Yeah.
So this is from the audience. Atmospheric methane is a huge climate problem and cannot be separated from natural gas production or use. How far are you willing to go to reduce or eliminate natural gas use?
How far? I think on the state level, I think state needs to legislate ways and sensible ways to how we could eliminate natural gas usage. On the federal level, I think Oregon can lead as a state in terms of doing that. On the federal level, America, it's a very complex economy and country. So I think it would be harder and very, very tough to get things working on, and realistically to get things working on the federal level. So I think Oregon can lead by example. I just read the other day, Utah, which is controlled by Republicans, they introduced a long list of climate crisis action plan that they're planning to take, and one of them is cap and invest. So I think that there are sensible ways and realistic ways that Oregon can lead, and hopefully that could ripple down across the country.
So I want to follow up on these. So you're bringing up a lot of climate action that I think many in the room would agree that needs to be done, but you're also running with a party that at the national level probably wouldn't join you in the platform and canceling a lot of these things. If elected to Congress, how would you work with convincing the Republicans in your party to join you in this platform that they haven't been too keen on wanting to join as of now?
So an example of that is I sent a couple of Republicans, actually state Republicans in Oregon and even the national level, what Republicans in Utah are doing about the climate. Because Utah, it's a trifecta state just like Oregon, but rather it's controlled by Republicans, the state, Senate, and the governor's office. So they have like a long list of action plans. So I will convince, say, fellow Republicans that, hey, look, we need to stop pretending that climate crisis, it's something that we should ignore. Because, for example, Utah is doing something about it, and Utah is controlled by Republicans, and they're doing something about it. So it's something that we can't just ignore.
So something that affects communities of color around the entire nation is their proximity to air toxics. As we know, here in Eugene, the closest community to the air toxics pollutions are communities of color and low-income communities. Fortunately here, because of the work of activists in the city, we are one of the only cities that have a toxics right to know system where we can go online and see every single emission that is being released by the companies within city limits. If you were to get elected to Congress, would you support a bill that makes it a federal requirement for all companies to have to disclose their air toxic pollution?
Oh, absolutely. I think it makes sense to disclose toxic pollutions. In fact, one of the things I was thinking about the other day was that maybe we should have some way of even having labels on products. For example, hey, carbon, this product, for example, it costs this much carbon emitted in the atmosphere, just like we have nutritional labels on products. So I absolutely do agree with that, yes. Yeah.
If elected to Congress, would you support the criminal prosecution of fossil fuel CEOs if it was found that they had participated in any malpractice?
Malpractice that was illegal. I think anything illegal should be prosecuted, I believe. Yeah.
So malpractice could mean also things that aren't considered illegal right now. So would you be willing to pass legislation to make some of the malpractice illegal?
Some of the malpractice illegal?
Yeah, so for example, would you be willing to be more robust in the prosecuting of fossil fuel industries that have known for a very long time that what they were doing was harming the environment, but through campaign contributions have been able to legally, but not ethically, contribute to climate change?
Yeah, I think that's something I have to study, because I'm not one of, I tend to be more realistic and look at both sides of the argument than just make a statement. So it's something that I would have to look into before I make a judgment call on that. Yeah.
This is specifically to how you're going to, we get a question from the audience of the U.S. being one of the biggest polluter, but a talking point from your party tends to be that we have to get countries that haven't been able to develop in the energy sector, who tend to be countries who have also been part of colonization, that we have to get them to get better in their practices first without us doing anything. Do you believe that the United States has a maybe a moral responsibility to act on climate change before demanding colonized nations to act on climate change?
If you look at the consumption of a typical, say, person residing in the U.S. or some of the developed nations, if you take a look at the footprint of, say, our phones, televisions, cars, all these things, we pollute. I think one person, I don't know this, and don't quote me on the numbers, but I think a single person will emit either externalized carbon or maybe directly here, but would emit more carbon than, let's say, 20 people living in a village somewhere in the middle of Africa. So I do believe that high consumption countries should take bold actions. And I do believe that high consumption countries should take bold actions. An example of that is I gave up, actually, on a personal level, I gave up driving like 2 years ago. And I don't own a car personally, and I don't consume much, on a personal level. So I think at the end of the day, I think it's a personal, people need to take personal actions, not just legislations and government intervening in the crisis, but I also believe that people should take personal actions as well. Yeah.
You have 1 minute for your closing statement.
Okay. So I just wanted to say that I'm the only Republican here, and because I do believe in climate crisis, and well, a fellow Republican here, Republican running in Congressional District 4, but I do believe in the climate crisis, and I would say that I know a lot of you guys might feel like, okay, Republicans can't really talk about climate or can really do something about climate. But I would encourage you to look at Utah, where Republicans control everything, but they're taking bold actions on climate. So you do have choice in this election. DeFazio has been there for 32 years. I think I was 6 years when he got in. And Oregon District 4 needs change. It needs something, needs a brand new face. It needs brand new Congress. We need term limits. We need campaign finance reform, because without this, America is just gonna slip into oligarchy. And I hope you guys can look more into my campaign, because I'm a reasonable Republican. I don't think I just shut people off, and I listen to both sides of the argument. And thank you so much for listening. Yeah. Thank you.